anyway, so in psychoanalytic theory, we're talking about how the provinces of the mind play a role in who we are. Don't worry, I'll go into what those are. We're talking about the different levels of consciousness and how both of these two things are going to connect and communicate with each other in order to have a further understanding of our behaviors, our understanding of the world, and what is real to us, right? In addition to that, we also talk about the different stages of psychosexual development. There are 4, 5, 4, it doesn't matter. But we're mostly going to be focusing on 3. The last 2 is one of those really brief mentions because they're not as important as the first 3. And on top of that, we're going to be talking about anxiety and what we do, according to Freud and his later, I don't want to say friends, but they're not friends, his later followers, people who try to deviate from him, what they say about anxiety and what we do about it, right? On top of all of that, Freud goes into this whole entire beautiful thing called psychoanalytic therapy, where he uses free association to further understand the unconscious mind. All of these terms we'll talk about every one of those terms as I go, so don't worry if you do not have a chance to copy everything off of this slide. So, provinces of the mind, we're talking about the id, the ego, and the superego. What is the id? Yep.
The ego and the super ego. The id is like the good side. No, the super ego. The super id is the good side. It's like whatever you want.
Yeah.
Sort of represent the animalistic desires.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So it's the pleasure-seeking principle. It is the part of your brain, part of you, who actually goes ahead and does what it wants without thinking of any other consequences. What is the ego?
It stops you from seeking the pleasure?
Not necessarily. I mean, it kind of does, but the ego is more of the reality principle. The ego is the one thing that actually sees what's really going on, and it does stop the pleasure seeking of the id, but it does it because the superego is playing a role in it. Now, what is a superego then? What does a superego?
Isn't it kind of tells you what's considered morally wrong, so it kind of stops it from like going savage in a way?
Yeah, it's the moral principle, right? It tells you what's right and wrong. It's the one thing that's telling the ego that don't listen to the id because the id is crazy, so you got to listen to what I say. It is also the ego ideal, which essentially just means that this is the being that you want to be, right? The easiest way to think about it is in terms of the angel and the devil on your shoulder. The devil on your shoulder is the id. It always tells you this is what you want to do, and therefore you must do it. It sounds amazing, right? Why not spend $2,000 on shopping or buying whatever you like to buy, right? The reason? Because your superego is telling you that if you spend $2,000, you're not going to be able to eat for the next 3 weeks, right? And the ego is you, the human being in the middle between the devil and the angel on your shoulder, who has to make a decision between the id and the superego, who has to fully compromise between the two in order to make the final decision. Make sense? If it's confusing between id and superego, think of Superman when you think of superego, because he's the moral code and he knows exactly what needs to be done and everything. Now, when we talk about the id, ego, and superego, there are personalities that are more id-dominant, more ego-dominant, and more superego-dominant. In all of Freud's theories and everything that we're going to be talking about today, it's really important to have a really good balance. So when a person is considered as id-dominant or superego-dominant, it essentially means that that person is not perfectly balanced. The most balanced person is usually the one who's ego-dominant, because the ego is able to create the perfect balance between what the id wants and what the superego wants, right? Does anyone know what I mean by a person who is very id-dominant?
Sure, I do.
Usually does things impulsive decisions. You can possibly say from impulsive decisions. So long as it really I was thinking more of possibly extrovert, possibly more risk taking.
It could be, yeah, absolutely. When we think about the different types of big five characteristics, extroversion definitely falls into the id a little bit more, right? A highly extroverted or highly open person in terms of the scale of openness is more likely to be id dominant because it gives them pleasure to try something new, to meet new people, or to do all these very largely extroverted behaviors, right? Risk behaviors, definitely. Right? Because what they're really seeking is that dopamine increase. Remember how we talked about dopamine and how it's linked to what you really enjoy and what you like. A person who's very id dominant does not care if taking those drugs has really negative consequences. At the end of the day, it's that brain system that's allowing you to feel really great in that very short period of time. Now, how about a person who is super ego dominant? Now, why would it be bad for you to be highly moralistic and understanding right and wrong and all of that stuff? Yep.
Because you're not very open-minded to anything that you're very structural, like this is moral,
So they're really strict with their own moral code, right? They're not going to be able to fluctuate between anything. They're not going to be able to tell you that, yeah, that seems wrong, but at the same time, I understand why a person is doing that. Instead, they're going to say that's against the law, therefore it's wrong, right? Any other thoughts about the super ego dominant person? Yep.
Conscientious? Somebody that's conscientious?
In what way?
Thinks about consequences when they do an action, and let's say there's a test, they know to study and prepare because they know it's the right way to go.
That's true, right? They go with the right way, whatever the right way is, right? Now, a person who is id dominant is more likely to have substance use disorders, like I just said. How about a person who's super ego dominant? What type of disorders do you think they're more likely to have? If you're stuck in a moral code. Why? Is that it? Why?
OCD.
Just because you overthink everything. If you know what's right and what's wrong, and you just always choose to do what's right.
So where's the anxiety come from?
Because you don't take risks. You know, like, I don't know.
Wait, what was that?
It doesn't have to necessarily mean that you believe that, but it's what sometimes society or maybe your religious and they say that's right. So you have to feel like you have to be like a perfectionist, everything has to be right. And you go that way even if you might not believe it or like it's hard.
Yeah.
Always. So
You
that
can't
feeling
always
that
do
you
what's
mess
right.
up.
Right. You can't always do what's right, right? So a person who is highly balanced towards the super ego side, so super ego dominant, is more likely to experience anxiety, depression, because they go hand in hand, largely because, yes, they understand what's right and what's wrong, but sometimes there are gray areas where they cannot tell what's right and what's wrong, and sometimes what is considered as right to society is not necessarily right to them, and now they have to decide which one are they really following, their own moral code or society's moral code. They also have to consider the fact that if they make one choice, what happens on the other side. So they're the really heavy thinkers that ruminate on every little thing that happens, and then a lot of times nothing really gets done. Yep. Why is it paranoid? A cult leader will be more id. Yeah. Largely because they claim that they're doing it for the right and the wrong. That's how they get their people. But the reality is they're doing it because it makes them feel good. Yeah. Cult leaders are more often not antisocial. And they just know how to manipulate the masses. Yeah. They're a funny group. Yeah.
So paranoia is something more on the delusion side, right?
Yeah.
Something that's not reality, but you perceive it to be as it is.
Yes. So there is a level of delusion, a level of all of that, right? Not to the point where it becomes psychotic, right? But it's because there's a level of right and wrong, and there's a fear of getting in trouble, right? Fear of breaking the law and what will happen if I break the law, right? And then that's where the anxiety comes up, right? You keep asking yourself, these are people who keep asking themselves, what if, and then nothing ever gets done. Some of you are looking at me like, oh God, that's me. Yeah. Anyway, so that's the provinces of mind. In terms of level of consciousness, we have 3. Do we know what those are? Consciousness. We have conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. Subconscious is often also considered as the preconscious. So if you see preconscious somewhere, it's also the subconscious. It doesn't really matter. So the conscious is the easiest one. It's what you're aware of. That's easy, right? You're aware that you're in this room. You're aware what time it is and all that stuff. The subconscious or the preconscious is what you're semi-aware of. Sometimes you get a little bit confused of what you know, but after a little bit, you end up knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. And lastly is the unconscious, is what you're not aware of at all, right? And because you're not really super aware of it, it's one of those things where you try to dive a little bit deeper and try to figure it out. Easiest way to remember this is this beautiful idea of the iceberg where, you guys know the idea of the iceberg, I'm sure, where you can only see the top tip of it, and that's the conscious level, and that's your thoughts, that's your perceptions, these are your experiences, and these are your subjective experiences. The subconscious is your memories and your stored knowledge, so you don't need it right away, so therefore it stays away for a bit, but once you need it, you can open up the vault and find out a little bit on your own. The unconscious, on the other hand, are your fears, your violent motives, your unacceptable social desires, any type of irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences, selfish needs, all of these things. Oh, scary. Anything that was scary as well. Any long past repressed memory of anything all falls into the unconscious level. Okay? So now we have the id, ego, and superego. We have the conscious, subconscious, and the unconscious, right? All 6 of these play a role together, and they kind of like go in and out at all times. According to Freud, which one of these 3 is the most important? It's the unconscious. Right? Because our whole entire goal is to figure out what's going on in the unconscious and what is making you, you. In Freud's theory, the consciousness is not nearly as important as the unconscious, because the unconscious is where who you are really lie. Alright, so this is just a nice, beautiful breakdown of how the id, ego, and superego also plays along with the iceberg idea. Notice the superego and the ego is relatively conscious in some extent, so you have an idea of what your right and wrong is. You have a large idea of how the reality is placed for you, but the id is completely submerged. So it's one of those really unconscious desires that you have. You're going to play off on it, but you don't really quite know why. Make sense?
So you say that the unconscious has superego and id, or just id?
It's all of them. The unconscious is all 3. Yeah. The only one that's completely submerged in the unconscious is the id.
Can you have a bigger ego than super ego?
You can.
What is
A
the
person
difference?
who's perfectly balanced should be perfectly equal. Yeah.
What it means to have a bigger ego?
What do you mean? Like, are you asking what it means for a person to be balanced in towards the ego?
No. Like in this picture, for example,
Mm-hmm.
what would a person be if he had the whole thing as a, no, not the whole thing as an ego, like half of the thing as an ego and the other half, the other 25% are super ego and E.
I would think that just generally means that the person is more reality structured. They don't think about the right and wrong. They don't think about what they seek, like the pleasure seeking, but rather they think about what's solely in front of them at that moment, and that's it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting thing to think about, right? If a person's ego is too big. Alright. Anyway, any questions on these? The way that our brain is structured, or the mind is structured, not the brain, actually tells you a lot about how we behave and how we see the world. we have the stage of psychosexual development, where there's going to be a focus on the erogenous zones, where we're talking about pleasure seeking, which immediately we should think about the id anyway. We're going to be talking about 5 stages, but like I said earlier, only 3 really matter, and that's the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stage. Genital stage is sometimes called maturity, so either way. So we're only going to really focus on the oral, anal, and phallic. Latency in general, we're probably going to spend like less than 5 minutes on, so yeah. We're also going to be talking about fixation, what it means to be fixated on each one of these, technically 3 stages. Okay? So I'm going to give you a breakdown. The erogenous zones is essentially any part of the body that provides pleasure for that child in the specific stage of development that they're in. Okay? And we're going to talk about which ones follow with what. And based off of those specific erogenous zones, that's where the child receives the highest level of pleasure. Again, it's dependent on which stage of development they're in. All right? We're going to have all those 5 stages. A fixation is essentially when a person is stuck. Fixation literally means stuck. But in terms of Freud, we're talking about being stuck in a specific stage of development. And in order for that to happen, it just means that whatever was happening during those stages, the child was not able to get past those traumas or get past the anxiety, and therefore they got stuck in that stage. And we see specific behaviors that are linked to being fixated on those stages, and we'll be talking about that as we go. Okay? Any questions about these terms so far? Yep.
What's the first one again?
Erogenous zones. It is the part of the body where the child receives the greatest level of pleasure, depending on their stage of development. Any others? Okay. So, starting off with the oral stage, we are talking about babies between 0 and 18 months, so a year and a half. In here, the erogenous zone is the mouth, but later on, and which essentially means that their highest level of pleasure is obtained through their mouth, right? And what do you think they're really doing? They're breastfeeding, they're eating, right? They're sucking on whatever comes into their hand, and you get the idea. Later on, it's no longer just eating and tasting, though. It expands onto, I forgot emergency. It expands onto the other senses, right? In terms of the mouth, the emergence of teeth also tells you a little bit about what stage within the oral stage the children are in. In the earlier oral stage, the children did not develop teeth yet, so everything is fine and dandy up until their teeth shows. And if the child's breastfeeding and there's teeth, what do you think the child's going to do?
Bite.
There's going to be a level of biting. And if there's biting involved, what do you think mom's going to do? Cut off breastfeeding, take away the breast, right? No more feeding, switch to the bottle, weaning off, right? That causes a level of anxiety for the child. Okay, so in the later stages, in the later months of the oral stage when teeth are coming in, the child feels a high level of anxiety because they want to feed, but mom's not letting them anymore. All right, so the child has to learn to either stop biting or have to start appreciating the bottle a little bit more. One way or another, they still feel anxiety over their mom's neglect because mom does not want to get bitten. All right? Like I said, it later expands onto other senses. So this is around the same idea of the child, if they see you, they're going to stare at you a little bit longer because they haven't seen you before. Especially between 5 to 6 months, they really stare at you because they've really never seen you before, so they're just trying to take in every one of your features and try to figure out who you are. It's fascinating if you witness this a lot on the train. Yeah, I told you about my friend. I think. This is also the stage where children grab whatever's in front of them. You guys know what I mean, right? And that's largely because of texture or because it's new. right? They see something new, they grab it, and then where does it go immediately?
Their mouth.
Their mouth, right? They try to eat everything. But that's the idea, all right? They want to explore, they're starting to explore the world using their senses. And most importantly, they're trying to see what's edible and what's not because they're exploring. They're exploring through their mouth. During this stage, they are also highly dependent on their caregivers. What that means is if they cry, they have to be cared for immediately, right? In the earlier stage of, in the earlier oral stage, the second the child cries, more often than not, the mom goes to them immediately and takes care of them and everything's wonderful, right? When the child gets a little bit older, however, if the child cries, there's a chance that there's a bit of a delay. Largely because the mom and parents and whoever's taking care of them knows that the kid's probably fine and it's okay to let them cry for just a few extra minutes, right? But because of that, that also causes anxiety because now not only are they biting and not getting what they want, they're also not getting the same level of care as they used to get when they were like 1 month old, right? So now they're getting really freaked out because they're not being cared for, even though they are, right? During this stage, their basic needs are more often met very passively. So again, they cry, people come to them. That's it, right? They don't have to demand care. Their demand is literally just crying. Just the sound itself causes the care to happen. So they don't ever have to think about how do I get fed, all right? They learn from a very, very early age that if they make this funny noise, this screeching, annoying noise, then someone's going to come to try to get them to stop, right? Because they're so young, most of it is based off of consistency, though. If the mother or the primary caregiver is consistent, then that's fabulous. If they're inconsistent, then the child does not seem to understand the idea of a structure or the idea of who to trust and their basic needs and all of that stuff. So a level of consistency is very, very important for this kid. And more often than not, if there's a level of consistency, the child has to also learn between a balance between a good and a bad experience. And what that generally means is if the child does not understand what's good and what's bad, then they're going to go in both extremes without thinking about anything in between. Does that make sense? Any questions about this so far? Okay. So, like I said, a fixation is essentially when you're stuck on that stage. What will cause a child to get stuck in the oral stage of life?
Losing a sense. Losing a sense. Maybe sight.
Okay. That would, except at that young age, they would not know what those senses are meant for. So think about it. What will cause them high levels of anxiety to the point where they're fixated? Yep.
Maybe they're being breastfed for too long.
Okay. Tell me more. What do you mean?
So like for example, like whenever the baby cries, like baby gets breastfed. So like they get attached to being breastfed basically. Whenever they want, they gotta have it.
Okay. So whatever they want, they gotta have. So therefore, they don't have any understanding of boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What else? Yep.
Just like total neglect, like every time they cry and they're hungry, there's nothing for them to feed on or anything. Their anxiety is just like never brought down. They're always anxious. Just neglect in general.
And what have we said about children who are neglected? Are they highly dependent or highly independent?
Dependent.
Which one?
Dependent.
Dependent or independent?
Independent.
They're independent. All right. A child who's highly neglected is more likely to grow to be highly independent. A child who has been smothered and highly nurtured and spoiled is that highly dependent or independent? Independent. All right. So the oral character can be both highly dependent or highly independent. Freud likes a good balance between the two. So obviously you have to learn to be both dependent and independent of people. All right. Here, for a person who is orally fixated, they are also the type passively waiting for things to happen to them and for them, and does not really seem to understand that they themselves have to do something. All right? Who can give me an example of what that means, or how that looks like? Yeah.
When a person waits for someone else to do, I don't know, their basic laundry.
Mm-hmm. So they're just waiting for someone else to do it, right? Their hamper is super, super high, right? And they're just waiting for someone to be like, oh, let me do your laundry for you. You're clearly not going to do it, all right? What else? What else would that look like? Yep.
When they wait for opportunities to come to them.
Mm-hmm. So they don't apply for jobs. They just wait for someone to see how great they are, and just hand them a job as they go, right? Yep. They're just passively waiting for experiences, for opportunities. Yep. What else? Yep.
Someone who's sheltered, maybe?
It could be, right? A person who's sheltered is also falls in the category of highly nurtured.
Like spoiled?
Yeah, they're spoiled, they're nurtured, so they just wait for things to happen, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say something because I know that some babies, like my cousin, she was breastfed for a very long time and she always had the
Pacifier?
yeah, so it's like whilst everybody was learning how to talk, it took a very long time to learn how to talk because it was always in her mouth when it was time for her to actually start talking. So I guess you could also say fixation, like a long period for her to
So she didn't need to learn how to talk, right? Because she was cared for in every single way. So what was her motivation for learning to talk, right? And the pacifier, I don't know what it is about the pacifier, but babies love it. You know, the second you give them pacifier, they're calm and everything. So maybe it's like the rubbery texture or something that calms them. I don't know what it is, but there's something about pacifiers that do that to them.
I think it is the hurting of the teeth growing.
Okay, so when the teeth comes in, they're in a lot of pain, so the pacifiers do that to them. All right, but when a child, I don't, yeah. But at the same time, if the child is learning how to talk a little bit later than usual, it's largely because they don't really need to. Their needs are met, right? Obviously, this comment excludes the developmental, the children who are a little bit developmentally slower, or hits like the Asperger's or autism spectrum. Obviously, it does not fall into those categories. But children who are normally developed, right? If they are a little bit slower in learning how to talk, it's usually because they don't need to. Everything's already met. They're good. All right? They can learn how to walk. They'll talk a little bit later if necessary. I used to have a client who did not start talking until he was 2. And he only started talking because his parents put him in a nursery where he had to talk. And then after that, they couldn't get him to stop talking. Yeah.
Could that also be due to language? Because I have a nephew, he's going to be 2 soon and he's still not talking. So we're thinking it's both Spanish and English at the same time. Like, is it just the language, maybe?
It could be. It's hard to say. There's also no specific moment that a child has to learn to talk. So as long as he starts before school starts, he should be fine, to be honest. There's no specific time. All right? So this is a person who's passively, in terms of passively waiting, your book, I have to emphasize this is your book, but I thought it was really funny, so I thought I'll tell you guys anyway. Your book describes students who tells professors why they have to pass the class instead of actually doing the work to pass the class. I'm just saying. You guys know what I mean, right? Every year I get at least like a few. I teach experimental, so every time I teach experimental, I get a few students who will always be like, I have to pass the class, this is my last semester. What do you think my thought is?
Work hard. Do all your homework, all the papers.
Yeah. That's my only comment. So a lot of it is also expecting things from other people, but not themselves. A person who is orally fixated does not seem to think that they need to do anything. It goes back to passively waiting. And they just expect people to cater to their needs. Make sense? All right. So, what do you think? What type of behaviors do you think they're really doing then? Aside from this, obviously. It's really easy to tell if a person is very orally fixated.
to the smoking.
Smoking will be one. What else? Yep.
Putting their thumb in their mouth.
Yep. Thumb sucking. What else? Biting objects. The people who are constantly chewing pens, which is really gross, by the way. Biting their nails, also really gross. Someone who's constantly chewing gum, I guess less gross. All right. What else? Oh, people who drink a lot, definitely. What else?
Or eat a lot. Eat a lot?
Yep. Highly gluttonous people. Yep.
People that don't stop talking.
Yeah, people who never stop talking. You can never get a word in because they will never stop talking. All right. There are also people who make really great speeches, by the way. And a lot of them are politicians. Yeah. So, do we get them all? Talkers, speeches, politicians, chewing gum, biting nails, smoking, gluttonous. Obviously, there's more to it, but this is a general idea of it. Yeah. Any questions? Good? Can I go to the next slide now? Right. So the next one is the anal stage, which is between 1.5 years to 3.5 years old, sometimes 4. Here, the erogenous zone is the anus, and the main concept of this stage is the ability to hold and withhold objects. Obviously, in the very beginning of the anal stage, what do you think the child's going through? Potty training, right? So what potty training is really teaching the child is to understand their bodily functions and to understand when they need to go and how to get to the bathroom quickly enough, right? Obviously, it does not happen in a day. And if the child is pushed into potty training a little too early, then they get really stressed out because they really do not understand their bodies just yet. So a lot of times, if you see a child who is like, I forget what culture. I read an article about a culture that started potty training at like a year, when a child was a year old or something, which is super early. Don't know what happened to the child, but in my mind, I'm like, that's super early. Child's not even in the anal stage yet. So all these things are going into my head when I was reading about it. But the idea is you can't really train the child to understand their body until they realize that they have a body. That makes sense, right? Because for the longest time, the babies are just like waving their arms around and they just see a random thing floating. They don't realize it's them. Yeah, like their eyesight is so small, they don't even realize that they have a body. They cry and something gets done. They don't care. All right, so it doesn't make any sense to do potty training until they realize they have a body. Right? So, yeah.
Sometimes I can't go wrong because what you explained earlier. My sister's training my nephew, who's not 2 weeks yet, doing potty training. He just takes off his diaper randomly and calls it. He doesn't know.
Right, because he doesn't understand it yet, right? So there's no level of understanding of what potty training means, right? So you might as well try potty training your cat instead. Some people do that. Some people train their cats to use the toilet.
Yeah, I do that.
It's actually quite interesting. I don't have a cat, but if I did, I might try it too. Anyway, so here in the anal stage is focusing on a level of self-control and obedience. So self-control, obviously understanding the body functions and all that stuff. Obedience is whether or not you understand the parents' rules and regulations and how to do this and all of that stuff. All right? Questions? Good? Okay. So when a child's fixated in the anal stage, what do you think is their greatest level of stress? There's like we already talked about, potty training too early. That's super stressful.
I mean, control, when they have a lot of things to do.
Maybe?
No, I mean, when they grow up. No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like the long term, like.
Oh yes. So. So yes, when we talk about the anal character, we're talking about the level of control they're able to withhold or withstand when they're a little bit older. All right. So a lot of this is linked to the parental styles. All right. What are the 3 parental styles? Do we know? Authoritative.
And the one with both parents.
I keep hearing authoritative, but that's all I heard. Authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive, right? So authoritarian is the super strict parent, kind of like the military style. You do this, this, this. Don't question anything. Authoritarian is a little bit more, less structured, but a lot less permissive. So it's right in the middle. It's a perfect balance between the two. Allows the child to explore the world, gives them rules to keep them safe, you know. And permissive is the one that just lets the kid do whatever they want. Right? So again, it goes into issues of self-control, which again goes back to the parental styles. So for an authoritarian parenting style, what do you think happens to the child's level of self-control? So a parent who has high levels of rules and regulations. You must do A, B, and C. This is how it's done. Don't question me. Yep.
They do the exact opposite.
They could.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, so for the person who is confined in the home because they're following very strict rules, more often than not, the second they're allowed to leave the home, they go crazy. They do everything that they were not allowed to do before. Right? So that happens, so that's issue of self-control. Yep.
They're also not likely to self-identify themselves. They don't know who they are as a person because that's just, whoever they are, it's just because their parents expect them to be. So they don't have like a self-identity of themselves.
Yep, they have no idea who they are. All right, so they kind of have a split, right? They see their own actions, but at the same time, they'll say things like, yeah, but it's because X, Y, and Z happened to me when I was a kid, and my parents forced me into this world and put me in such restriction, so therefore I'm doing all of these. They don't take responsibility for their own actions because they don't see them as doing it, but another part of themselves. Yeah.
Also, they cannot be independent because they always follow their parents' rules.
And if they try to deviate from their parents' rules, right, that's when they get really super anxious and super depressed because now they're wondering, what can I be doing? Right? There's no sense of self for this. For the authoritative child, authoritative parent and their child, they have a better level of self-control. They know what's right and what's wrong, and they could understand what's the right thing to do. How about for the permissive?
I think a higher level of self-control.
What?
A higher level of self-control. I think a higher level of self-control.
Higher?
Yeah.
Why? Why higher?
Because they are open to everything. They get hurt to learn.
Okay. So they experience a lot of different things, so they're more likely to kind of fall back or hold themselves back a little bit more. Do you agree with that? That could happen. Yeah.
Isn't this like the, I don't remember what it was, but where there was an over-control, or an under control child? I think they used.
Yep.
Under control was more likely to be aggressive, things like that.
Yep.
Is this going to be the same thing?
It will fall into the same category. All right. So the permissive parent will typically have a very under-controlled child. Right. So it can go in 2 different ways. Right. The child might be has high level of self-control because they're like, okay, my parents didn't do anything to hold me back, so I have to hold myself back. So they're highly independent. At the same time, they can also be that child who's like, well, my parents never held me back, so I'm going to do everything I want. Right? It can go both ways. It just honestly depends on how they voice their own narrative.
What if you have 2 types? I mean, let's say your mom was here from year 1 to 6, then she died, then your grandmother took care of you, and she's assertive, and the other one is permissive. What would that have, create?
What that will create?
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
I
Was
mean-
grandma the authoritative one?
Yeah.
Grandmas are usually not
No.
authoritative.
No, like domestic.
Grandma's usually very basic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's really hard to say. It's based off of how the child understands their parents' stuff and how it's worked through. Right? So I have had a client, they moved, where his mom died when he was 5 and he lives with his grandma. Right? Grandma is relatively permissive, because she's grandma. Alright? And he acts out, but not to her. He acts out to everybody else. So when you think about it, it's as if he understands that grandma's the parent now, so he's respectful, but he's disrespectful for everyone else. So that's a displacement of anxiety or displacement of anger to other people. And we'll be talking about displacement in like probably Wednesday at this point. Alright, let me finish the anal stage. So the authoritative parent, so the authoritative parent is essentially the one that does not lead to a high level of fixation or any fixation at all, by the way. So, because that's the perfect balance. You remember how I said Freud likes the balancing stuff? This authoritative, the authoritative parent is always the balanced one. Now, in terms of the fixations, we have 2 ways it can go. We have, do we know what they call? Fixations in the anal stage. There's 2 ways. We have the anal retentive or the anal expulsive. Okay? The person who is anally retentive is a person who is highly organized. They are obsessive, they're compulsive, which leads us to what disorder? OCD. They can also fall into the category of OCPD, which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, largely because they need to be highly organized. They're high perfectionists. They're relatively stingy because they're holding back on their own money, they're holding back on everything. So remember holding and withholding. If you're fixated, you're going to be stuck on those behaviors for a very long period of time. They're very orderly. They follow rules by the book. They're super rigid. And they're subservient to authority figures. Because they need the authority figures to tell them what to do, how to do it. So this highly links to what type of parenting style? Authoritarian. The military style. Alright. Now on the other hand, the anal expulsive is one who is highly disorganized. So the super messy person, on the one hand you have the super neat person who has everything in the perfect 90-degree angles, to the point where you wonder if it's a store or if it's their bedroom. On the other hand, you have a highly disorganized person where their clothes are on the floor, books are in a pile, there's no shelves because who needs shelves when you can just throw them on the floor? Yeah.
I have a question. When it comes to OCD, the whole orderly thing, isn't that not always true? for
Yes,
some people?
that is
Like-
also not
Like they could fixate on like a light and it'll just bother them for like.
Yeah. OCD is characterized by an obsessive thought pattern where a repetitive behavior will calm the obsessive thought. So it does not have to be cleaning, it does not have to be a light switch, it doesn't have to be any of that. It can be something. I had a client once who would just keep asking questions. Did I tell you guys about her?
Yeah.
Yeah?
No.
Maybe? I don't know. Anyway, so she had OCD, but her constant thought is something's going to happen to my mom. So she will constantly ask her mom questions like, "Are you home yet?" And her mom is in front of her, so obviously she's home. But she'll keep asking it because she's not satisfied with how the question was asked or answered. And that's OCD because those questions helped alleviate her thoughts that something's going to happen to her mom. Anyway, let me finish this slide and then we're done with the anal stage. So we have highly disorganized, we have little to no self-control. We have a person who's always late. So whether it's showing up late, giving papers in late, they're just so disorganized that they don't understand calendars or clocks. They're super chaotic. Like I said, their room probably looks like a hurricane went through it. They have a compulsive need to defy authority. Alright? This can also come from an authoritative parent. Alright? If they're completely sick of their parents being such military style people, then perhaps they're going to go against everything they have worked for since they were a kid. Alright? Any questions on this?